This is VOA Africa.
Hello, I'm Esther Gitu-Yort. It's Thursday, March 4th. Welcome to Africa 54. Due to the global outbreak of COVID-19, Voice of America is taking every necessary precaution to safeguard its employees. So our broadcast will look different today and in the near future as we, out of an abundance of caution, reduce our staffing at VIEW headquarters here in Washington. We're working to help keep you informed about what's going on and appreciate you staying with us on Africa 54. Police and soldiers fired into the air in northwest Nigeria as violence broke out amid the return of 279 kidnapped schoolgirls to their families on Wednesday, a day after their release, according to two Reuters witnesses. At least 3 people were shot, but it was not immediately clear by whom, the Reuters witnesses said. Chaos broke out as parents, impatient to take their children home, burst into a hall where government officials were giving lengthy speeches in front of the newly freed girls, one of the witnesses said. The government official fled the hall as parents began to grab their children and leave. Outside the school gates, gunshots could be heard, said the witnesses. Police fired tear gas upon a group of protesters outside the school, and soldiers began to shoot into the air. United Nations Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet called on Ethiopia on Thursday to grant United Nations monitors access to the Tigray region to investigate reports of continuing killings and sexual violence that may amount to war crimes. In a statement, she said that multiple parties to the conflict had been identified as possible perpetrators, including the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, Eritrean Armed Forces, Amhara Regional Forces, and allied militia. Sudanese citizens will have to wait a bit longer for the relief promised by a recent government devaluation of the local pound, with many still complaining of rising prices and lack of liquidity. Lauren Anthony reports.
Sudanese citizens will have to wait a bit longer for the relief promised by a recent government devaluation of the country's pound currency. Many are still complaining of rising prices. The central bank weakened the official exchange rate to 375 Sudanese pounds on February 21st. That's close to the black market rate. It was previously 55 pounds to the dollar. But the effects of the change are yet to be felt by ordinary citizens. One group waited outside of a Khartoum bank for hours.
Since this morning, it's been a battle here. First, they said it was a problem with liquidity. Then another time, they said the system is down. And there are so many people. I didn't have time to pray, have breakfast, because I've been here waiting.
Devaluation is seen as a key step in efforts to alleviate a chronic economic crisis that has plagued a political transition, following the April 2019 overthrow of former President Omar al-Bashir. But after months of struggle, the long bread queues that have been commonplace in the Sudanese capital since his departure still exist.
One bakery you find has flour but doesn't have gas. The other has gas but has no flour. Out of 5 or 6 bakeries in the area, maybe 1 or 2 can work, but 3 of them cannot. That's why you see these queues here.
One woman said she could only find gas on the black market. The Sudanese government had taken measures to try to limit price increases after devaluation and introduced a family support project providing monthly cash allowances of £5 that are eventually meant to reach 80% of the population. But according to the country's finance minister, these steps are only supposed to cushion the impact of any further inflation.
Lauren Anthony of Reuters filed that report. Senegal's main opposition leader, Ousmane Sonko, was arrested on Wednesday after hundreds of his supporters clashed with police in the capital while protesting against a rape accusation he denies. An employee at a beauty salon accused Sonko last month of rape near his house. Supporters burned tires and threw rocks at riot police, who responded by firing tear gas. At Cheikh Anta Diop University in central Dakar, hundreds of students charged the police and threw rocks. There were no immediate reports of injuries. The politician, who finished third in the 2019 presidential election, was summoned for questioning after his parliamentary immunity was removed last week. Sonko, a 46-year-old former tax inspector, accuses President Machi Sall's government of stirring up the charge to undermine his strongest rival. Burkina Faso's opposition has stepped up pressure on President Roch Kabore to follow through on a one-time campaign promise to allow former President Blaise Compaoré to return from exile. Supporters say Compaoré, who fled to Ivory Coast after being ousted in 2014, would bring back security. Critics, however, say his influence is limited and he should face justice. Henry Wilkins reports from Ouagadougou.
It's been 7 years since Burkina Faso's former president Blaise Compaoré fled his compound to Ivory Coast after a popular uprising against his attempt to extend his nearly 3 decades in power. But his Congress for Democracy and Progress, CDP party, says they're finishing second in November's election, shows support for Compaoré, and his return is growing. Amari Sawadogo, one of more than 1 million displaced Burkinabes, was driven out of his home by terrorists 2 years ago and says life was better under Compaoré.
When he was in charge, we never experienced insecurity, so we believe in his way of ruining work. His return can help us be safer.
Compaoré was an autocrat and made neutrality deals with jihadist groups in Mali in return for security at home that were later scrapped. Compaoré committed Burkina Faso to the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Mali, MINUSMA, and was still in power when their troops were for the first time attacked. Nonetheless, Compaoré's party says negotiations with armed groups need to be revived, and he is the one to do it.
Reason commands us to do it. This is a country that has been attacked for 5 years by unidentified groups, or unidentified men as they call them. If someone comes to attack your family for a few months, the first reflex is to find out who is attacking you and why.
President Roch Kabore's government last month, for the first time, raised the option of holding direct talks with terrorist groups in Parliament. But since then, it has become clear negotiations with armed groups have already commenced in the area around the city of Djibo. Despite a campaign speech that promised Compaoré's return, Kabore's ruling People's Movement for Progress Party, MPP, says it is not guaranteed. But they admit he had better relations with jihadists.
We haven't made direct accusations against anyone with regard to the phenomenon of terrorism, but we see that there were very good relations between certain terrorist groups attacking us and the old regime.
Analysts and officials say Compaoré's return could help Burkina Faso's political reconciliation, but are sceptical about the impact he could have on improving security.
Même s'il devait apporter des conseils aux dirigeants du jour,
providing advice to the leaders of today will be different in comparison to when he himself was in charge of the country's affairs. I think he can make a universal contribution in terms of political advice, but in reality, I'm not sure he can reverse the trend we have today.
With the scars of his ousters still visible, allowing Compaoré to return to Burkina Faso could reopen old wounds. Officials say he would also have to face justice for the violent 1987 coup that brought him to power. That could be enough of a threat to keep the former president's house empty. Henry Wilkins for VOA News, Ouagadougou.
As African governments make efforts to vaccinate their populations against the COVID-19 pandemic, some are not sure the jab will even reach their regions. Millions across Africa live in areas where terrorist organizations are busy regrouping and wreaking havoc. I spoke to VOA national security correspondent Jeff Seldin and began by asking him how the U.S. intelligence officials are addressing and sharing information with their African counterparts on the rising terror threats in Africa.
One of the big concerns U.S. intelligence officials have had with COVID-19, the coronavirus pandemic, is what impact it would have on terrorist organizations. And they saw two possibilities, and both have really come to fruition. In one sense, the onset of the coronavirus and the spread of the virus has limited operations in certain areas where, because it's impacting people are getting sick. Terrorist organizations have been forced to pull back. But as you mentioned, there are other factors that go along with the pandemic which feed into the problems that countries have that enable terrorist organizations to thrive. Weak economies, governments that are not able to be responsive or as responsive as local populations would like when they're experiencing problems, when they need help, when they need aid. And terrorist groups can take advantage of that. And so the intelligence community is seeing some of that as well. And they're seeing that because of all these grievances, in some cases, whether it's in Africa or elsewhere, even in the online, in the virtual environment, there are some benefits to recruitment that terrorist groups are seeing as a result.
How does AFRICOM support African governments with intelligence information and training to address insurgencies such as the ones we see in the Horn of Africa, Al-Shabaab, the Boko Haram in Nigeria, and Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb?
The support that the United States provides for its African allies goes back for years to when the African Command was first stood up. The idea has always been for the United States to have what military officials call a small footprint, as opposed to some places where the U.S. has gone and gotten involved where you've had tens of thousands of troops stationed there until recently. The goal has always been to have just a small number of U.S. officials, U.S. military personnel on the ground working with African allies. But that can include a lot of intelligence help as well in key areas. For example, back in 2014, when almost 300 girls were kidnapped by Boko Haram in Nigeria, the Chibok girls, the U.S. not only started flying more surveillance in Africa, in Nigeria, looking for where the girls might have been taken, looking for what Boko Haram was doing, but they also sent intelligence experts to the embassy in Nigeria to work with their Nigerian counterparts to make the most of that information. We've seen stuff like that happen in Somalia, where until recently the U.S. had about 700 troops working on the ground to combat al-Shabaab. Now, the other thing that's going on, though, is that there's always been an emphasis on helping the civilian side of things. It's not just a military fight. It's a fight to strengthen and enhance democratic systems and support systems and the economies of these countries. This is critical because if you don't support the economies, if you don't support good governance, that the problems will all feed into increased grievances for local populations, which in turn only then feeds the ability of these terror groups to gain strength and to create more problems.
Is the U.S. involved, or does it plan to get involved, especially as we see this surge of violence and jihadist movements in the Sahel region?
In terms of the Sahel, the U.S. has been content so far to let the French take the lead and put the onus on the French and other European countries working with France to go after the jihadists there. However, talking to French officials, they will tell you that they need the U.S. specifically when it comes to surveillance, intelligence, the ability to fly drones and other planes and have the equipment to look at on the ground and what's going on. Those are critical. And so the French would like to see more of that. And the U.S. has been trying to balance those requests from the French and African allies with its need to spread those type of capabilities elsewhere around the globe. But in terms of the counterterrorism efforts, again, the U.S. so far has been content to step back a little bit, recognizing it's a threat, but let countries like France take the lead, especially in the Sahel.
We know that the United States has the technology to intercept signals, take satellite photos, and fly unmanned drones, as you mentioned, for operations. But to get actionable intelligence, where the U.S. does rely mainly on human contact. Now, from a security standpoint, some may ask, is it necessary then to increase U.S. physical presence in hotspots of Africa?
And what you generally hear is military officials, intelligence officials saying, you need a little bit of both. The advantages you have and the advantages the U.S. can provide its allies by using drones, other planes, it's what it calls ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Those capabilities are critical to being able to know where the enemy is, what the enemy might be doing. But at the same time, intelligence officials will tell you there's no replacement really for humans, for humans on the ground, people on the ground doing dangerous work of infiltrating or following, monitoring these organizations from close up, these terrorist groups, and then relaying that information back to the U.S.
Jeff Seldin is VOA's national security correspondent. Nearly 50 countries have either received or ordered at least one of the 3 Chinese-developed COVID-19 vaccines, according to an Associated Press survey. VOA's Mariama Diallo has more on the vaccine rollouts.
Belgrade nightclub owner Duško Milojević has lost two close friends to the coronavirus. One was the same age and left two children behind.
He was a healthy man without any underlying medical conditions.
So when the Serbian government offered him a vaccine, Milojević, who got his second Sinopharm vaccine earlier last month, didn't care where the vaccine came from.
I only cared that it has been approved somewhere.
The Serbian government says it has purchased just over 2.6 million doses from various sources, mostly from China. Serbian authorities, who were on hand for the vaccine's arrival, thanked China.
We will be able to save thousands and thousands of lives. That is why tonight I am very overjoyed, and I can't find the words to express all of my gratitude to China.
Other countries, ranging from Chile in Latin America to Zimbabwe and Senegal in Africa to Indonesia in Southeast Asia, have also lined up to get the shots.
We're seeing certainly real-time vaccine diplomacy start to play out, with China in the lead in terms of being able to manufacture vaccines within China and make them available to others, largely low and middle income countries around the world.
Dr. Krishna Udayakumar, Global Health Innovation Center at Duke University, says that China is clearly exercising what is known as soft power.
So when you're making diplomatic decisions in 2 or 3 years, you may have fond memories of who was there to help you in the middle of a crisis.
The ruling Communist Party denies claims about Beijing's motives.
We believe that all countries should work together to resist vaccine nationalism and promote the impartial and reasonable distribution of vaccines, especially distribution among developing countries.
COVAX, an initiative led by the World Health Organization and partners, has been helping to accelerate development and equitable access to COVID vaccines. More than 170 nations, including the United States, are taking part in the initiative to deliver more than 2 billion doses worldwide. Deliveries under the program have already begun in Ghana, Ivory Coast, and India. Mariama Diallo, WEWE News.
We're excited to hear what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the discussion on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. We're also streaming our broadcast live on Facebook. Please watch and share our show with your friends. Also, check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Still to come, the U.S. makes the list of countries where democratic policies and institutions are in decline. We'll be right back.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linoch Mudu, in Washington, every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
Welcome back to Africa 54. Secretary of State Antony Blinken outlined broadly President Joe Biden's foreign policy Wednesday, saying this administration will promote democracy abroad, but not through costly military interventions, which he said had failed in the past. VOA senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain has our report.
With the U.S. military now operating in Iraq for 30 years and in Afghanistan for 20 years, critics of military interventionism have long called for the United States to bring its troops home and forgo future regime change efforts. On Wednesday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the Biden administration will forge its own course, seeking to promote democracy by example, not by force.
We will incentivize democratic behavior, but we will not promote democracy through costly military interventions or by attempting to overthrow authoritarian regimes by force. We've tried these tactics in the past. However well-intentioned, they haven't worked.
Blinken said military interventions have given democracy promotion a bad name and have lost the confidence of the American people. He promised the Biden administration will do things differently, including shoring up democracy at home as a foreign policy imperative. Blinken said China is the biggest threat because it is the only country with the power to challenge and destabilize an open international system. He said Washington must engage Beijing from a position of strength.
That requires working with allies and partners, not denigrating them, because our combined weight is much harder for China to ignore. It requires engaging in diplomacy and in international organizations, because where we've pulled back, China has filled in.
Acknowledging he and many members of the new administration, including Joe Biden, served under President Barack Obama, Blinken rejected any notion that the current team is a restoration of the Obama administration. He said that time has passed and Biden will see the world with fresh eyes. Cindy Sain, VOA News.
Despite no evidence that widespread voter fraud occurred in the 2020 U.S. presidential election, state lawmakers across the country are pursuing reforms that could change access to ballots and the time period to submit them, among other restrictions. VOA's Ken Faribault has more from the Midwest state of Iowa, one of the first to pass new voting legislation.
More than 2 million Iowans were registered to vote in the 2020 general election, a record in a state with a population of just over 3.1 million. Of 1.7 million ballots cast in the state last November, more than 1 million were submitted through the mail as absentee ballots, also a record, as many voters shunned the polls during a pandemic. Then President Donald Trump, a Republican, won Iowa, but lost the national election to Democrat Joe Biden. Now, Republicans who control Iowa's state legislature have passed a bill limiting early in-person voting and shortening the time allotted for absentee ballot submissions, among other provisions.
But the job of the State Government Committee is to ensure election integrity. You look at what you did right, what you did wrong, and you make improvements. And that's exactly what we're doing here today.
What Republicans promote as preventing potential voter fraud, Democrats see as voter suppression.
We want to make the freedom to vote as easy as possible for every single Iowa voter. I have many constituents who work multiple jobs, are parents, and they need the flexibility to vote when they have the time.
Democrats failed to eliminate what they viewed as harmful restrictions on voting, and the bill passed the state House and Senate with unified majority Republican backing. Iowa is not alone, and Democrats are sounding the alarm. At a recent hearing in Washington, newly elected Georgia Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff said legislation advancing in his state would disproportionately deter minority voting.
For example, to end Sunday early voting, which is used heavily by black and working class voters.
Georgia and Iowa are among dozens of states where Republicans seek to rewrite voting laws.
It's pretty widespread, and it's not surprising to me, having worked in this area of voting rights for some time, to see a backlash against a high turnout election.
Michelle Cantor-Cohen is with the Fair Election Center, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization addressing voting rights and election registration reform.
One thing that I think is really telling is that there's no rationale for it being given that makes any sense. It's not as if there was, for example, a problem with the polls being open until 9 o'clock instead of 8 o'clock. In fact, voters who work a long day may only be able to vote at that time.
Conversely, a lot of things that are meant to objectively suppress the vote have instead angered people and had them show up in record numbers.
Jessica Huseman with VoteBeat, an independent, nonpartisan news organization covering election integrity, says not all the proposed reforms are problematic.
There are a lot of states, for example, whose deadlines for requesting absentee ballots were unrealistically close to the election. And so election administrators just didn't have enough time to get those ballots out the door and have voters return them. But there is certainly no reason to change broad swaths of the election system that we have now. You see states that I think are overcorrecting from perceived but not real problems from the 2020 election in order to satisfy the most extreme parts of their base.
Voting reforms in Iowa await the signature of that state's Republican governor. The first in what Huseman says could be a wave of voting changes in multiple states ahead of the 2022 U.S. midterm elections. Kane Fairbaugh, VOA News, Chicago.
Nearly 75% of the world's population lives in countries where freedom is declining, including in the United States, according to a new report by the Washington-based research and advocacy group Freedom House. White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara has more on the Democratic backsliding.
From Indian farmers' protests to clashes between law enforcement and supporters of Black Lives Matter. The world's two largest democracies, the United States and India, are part of a global trend showing a decline in democratic policies and institutions, according to the Freedom of the World 2021 annual report by Freedom House. The Washington-based think tank focuses on democracy and human rights around the world.
The pandemic has really exacerbated this long-term democratic decline. A lot of undemocratic leaders seized on it and used it as an opportunity to consolidate power.
Freedom House's report rates people's access to political rights and civil liberties in 210 countries and territories. In 2020, 45 more countries had declining scores compared to those with improving ones, a trend that has continued for the past 15 years.
Hands up! Don't shoot! Hands up! Don't shoot!
The United States is still considered free but fell 3 points since last year, a large drop for an established democracy and mostly driven by lack of transparency under the Trump administration.
One way this manifested was the dismissal of inspectors general and the undermining of other institutions that are meant to hold government leaders accountable. But the kind of second part of this is the pandemic. It really showed this disregard for transparency. The federal government and also some state governments propagated false or misleading information. They obscured pandemic-related data and just generally caused a lot of confusion and politicized the response.
This democratic erosion is not new. The U.S. has fallen 11 points in the past decade. Noting the siege of the U.S. Capitol by Trump supporters earlier this year, on Wednesday, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken underscored the need to bolster democratic institutions.
Americans are increasingly polarized, and the institutions that exist to help us manage our differences so our democracy can continue to function are under strain. Shoring up our democracy is a foreign policy imperative. Otherwise, we play right into the hands of adversaries and competitors like Russia and China.
Less than 20% of the world population now lives in a free country, the lowest since 1995, according to Freedom House. India had the biggest drop since last year. Its status declined from free to partly free due to a multi-year pattern of Hindu nationalist policies and violence against Muslim minorities. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.
Chato Beach Resort ya wilayani Chato mkoani Geita, sehemu pekee mkoani Geita yenye mapumziko ya kweli, kwani una kila sababu ya kupumzika Chato Beach Resort, kwa kuwa usafiri wa kuja na kuingia Chato ni wa uhakika kwa safari za ndege za Jumatatu, Alhamisi na Jumamosi. Na sasa tutakusaidia kupanga safari za kitalii Burigi na Rubondo. Karibu. Hapa ndiyo Chato Beach Resort, upepo wa Ziwa Victoria unapovuma. Chato Beach Resort, mapumziko ya kweli.
Ili kuwa mwanafamilia bora wa Global TV, usisahau kusubscribe, like, kushare na kucomment. Baada ya kusubscribe, bonyeza alama ya kengele ili kupata taarifa kwa kila video inayopanda Global TV Online.